think the issue with a lot of people is they're trying to conform to the optimal, what people are saying, like this movement's more optimal. So like for me, just like a general rule of thumb for me, how I kind of think of my exercise selection is I think of, okay, what exercise can I get really good mind muscle connection with? Like where I can really connect, have good form, feel the intended musculature working well, where I can just fire it really well. And the second would be like comfort and safety. Like if I can do the lift with no pain, no discomfort, I can groove it really well. It's a keeper. And then the third one is, do I actually enjoy the movement I'm doing? So that's how I kind of like, I know it's not like so much science based, but I think for me, it's like I'm trying to blend and marry all these things to the movement. And I think in just my bodybuilding in general, I've learned to now like, okay, yes, I'm looking at research and I'm also, looking at practicality of things. Like sometimes, you can do something that's considered super optimal based on research, but it just doesn't jive well with life. And then again, the safety, the comfort, and the enjoyability factor. So I'm trying to marry all those things into Jeff's approach. And I think sometimes, when we're looking at other people, we have to like my advice to people who are trying to learn about bodybuilding, like a little more on a deeper level, not just looking at just the evidence-based stuff, but actually ask questions like, hey, why are you doing that behind the neck press? Why are you doing the upright row? What's the context behind it? Because if you can ask the question, if someone is kind enough to share the reasons why, well, that's how you're going to learn more. It might apply to your situation or it might not. But in the future, if maybe it does apply, then you're like, oh yeah, I remember when so-and-so was doing this because of X, Y, and Z. Maybe I can use that tool. So I think just, you have to be very open-minded. You have to be take initiative to ask questions and not just make assumptions. Like when you're following someone based off of some external source that says, hey, this is how you're supposed to do things.
So it's almost like what I'm hearing is we shouldn't judge people, and we should be open-minded and hear people out and listen to their side of the story and understand, and maybe we can improve ourselves. Even if we don't agree, maybe we can take something out of it. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, maybe I should run for president.
Yeah, I mean that you knocked it out of the park there. That's the key to everything, and I think that's one of the great things that we all love about bodybuilding is that there's things that we could carry into every aspect of our lives. I love the safety, comfort, and enjoyability kind of funnel that you run the exercises through, because say we have someone who maybe doesn't have too many injuries or maybe doesn't have too many constraints, that could be overwhelming. Like, where do I start? How do I know which exercise to do? Like, okay, I understand that I don't have to squat. I can leg press, or I could do this, or I could do that, but I can do any one. So which one do I do? And I think having that funnel of, well, let's try them out. Which one do you feel more of a connection with? Which one do you feel safest with? Which one do you feel, which one do you enjoy the most, right? Kind of like my RDL thing. I love RDLs, but I hate them at the same time, but I love them. So I enjoy doing them. And that's a huge factor. So I think even someone without any constraints, that can be overwhelming. So I think if we give that funnel of look, we can do all of these different pieces, but let's look at it through this funnel. And now we have maybe 3 options instead of 9 options.
But if you're fairly new or even intermediate or whatever, like if you master those basic exercises, like if you learn how to squat, if you learn how to do RDL, you learn how to do deadlift, you learn how to row, you learn how to overhead press, you master those, then it's a lot easier to take that technique and roll it into other exercises. And basically, like, our lifting library is kind of a great teacher for that. And it gives context around all of that stuff, like how to interplay movements. Like maybe, hey, this alternative might be better because of X, Y, and Z. But I think if you're just starting out, like learning to actually move from point A to point B with those basic movements, yes, I guess we'd call them the king of exercise, just because when you learn that technique, like when you learn how to do a deadlift, then an RDL becomes a lot easier to learn and to master. Same thing, you go into like any of the hinging movements, right? Good mornings, hyperextensions. It's all kind of based off same principles. And the same thing with squats and all that. So everything kind of just transcends off of that. So I think that's a good start. And then obviously when you're going through learning those movements, you start to feel what actually feels good or not. Like, oh yeah, they tell me I should be driving through my heel in a squat, but I'm off balance when I do it. I feel like I'm going to fall backwards. So, hey, maybe I do need to push a little bit more from my midfoot in order to maintain balance. Maybe you're like, hey, I want to get a little more quad activation out of my squat. So, okay, let me see what happens when I go to my midfoot. Oh, actually feeling my quads a little bit more so. So there's just like, you start from a base, but then you start to learn, like take notes on yourself, like what feels good, what doesn't feel good. Take notes, and then just slowly but surely start making these little changes, and you start learning these little nuances that you need to do to try to, again, get the best mind muscle connection. You're safe and comfortable, and you actually enjoy it, because no one wants to fall backwards on a squat. That's not very fun.
To kind of circle back to one of the points you made, Jeff, how sometimes learning the deadlift makes Romanian deadlifting better, or makes good mornings better, hyperextensions better. One of the studies that I've heard Eric talk about, he's covered it in mass, and I also cover it in the BFR course that should be out at this point. So be sure to check that out. But it's the idea of specificity, and the basic idea is that if you have something like a squat and a leg press, if you train the squat, well, let's start with if you train the leg press, you will get stronger at the leg press, but not much stronger at the squat. If you train the squat, you will get stronger at the squat as well as the leg press. And what the conclusion kind of was from that was that the complexity of the movement will have some carryover to less complex movements. So if you get those foundational movements down and you have the movement pattern of the squat and you're training the squat and you're progressing, you will likely have some carryover. It will be easier to make the transition from a squat to a leg press than a leg press to a squat. And that's important to keep in mind too, so that if we're kind of talking about cycling these lifts, if you've gotten great at the squat, there are many components of strength, right? There's the skill development, there's the muscle's ability to produce force, there's hypertrophy as a factor in strength. So if you keep training that squat, you've likely optimized the technique, the motor firing patterns, like all of those things, the mood state, all of those things you've likely perfected. So there's not many ways to improve other than hypertrophy at a certain point. So now if we go to something like a leg press, or move away from just hitting that top single in the back squat, now we start working on some hypertrophy. Now we're going to get some of that carryover to filling in that last bucket of the components of strength of that hypertrophy. And the skill of that squat doesn't go away. You don't need much to keep that skill. You just need to hit it every once in a while. And I know Eric has talked about this as well, is he's gotten away from like the traditional bodybuilding training to do Olympic weightlifting and strongman. But when he goes back to the bodybuilding stuff, he hasn't lost all of his strength. Like it's still there. So we keep the skills from our movements way better than we may think. So don't be afraid to, like we're kind of saying, don't be afraid to deviate from that. Definitely learn the foundational skills, the foundational movements, and you'll get some of that carryover to when you do your more isolation type machine based movements.
Yeah, because what I've noticed with like squatting, like Monday I squatted again, and I can tell like the strength was there. Like I could have lifted a lot more than I did, because I put 275 on for a couple sets of 6. I probably could have easily put 3 plates or more, but the technique I knew wasn't there. It felt very odd putting that bar back on my back. And on the first rep of each set, I was like looking like grandpa on the way down. Like it was just, I was going so slow just to kind of feel my way and acclimate, find depth, make sure everything was like, I was like, again, the fear. I'm like, okay, I got to keep my back a certain way. Don't deviate. So I was like, I just lost the skill of it. But the strength was still there though, which is kind of interesting because I think the Smith hack squat, like my quads are definitely strong from that. And like my hyperextensions, my RDLs, all my hip hinging, it's all like the performance is up. So like there's no strength loss or anything like that. It was just more of a skill. But I can kind of see how there's definitely some carryover there.
Yeah.
And I think Brad too. I think was it Brad that he wasn't direct squatting or direct deadlift. I can't remember, but one or the other. But he didn't do one of those lifts for a while. Went back to it and it was like he didn't lose much at all, if anything, because he still had one of the two big movements in there.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really important to keep in mind. And that's basically what I do every day with working with athletes, as I try to find ways to change painful movement patterns or variables of a movement pattern to maintain the training effect and then slowly integrate back into those movements. So we're constantly switching from different movements to different rep ranges and tweaking technique a little bit here and there. But the idea, and back to the lifting library, which is why it's such a great resource, is it's just basically like those old books, like Choose Your Own Destiny, or you kind of decide how you want the book to go or what have you. If this movement is painful and we've ruled out all the other aspects of pain for simplicity's sake, why don't we try this variation of it? Why don't we try a floor press? Why don't we try this? Why don't we try that? So having the ability to be flexible is probably one of the keys to injury reduction and management for the long-term career.
So let me throw this at you. So let's say I'm the guy that only has 2 years under his belt, and I'm like, I got to be optimal. So Nick, if I go to floor press instead of bench press, I'm going to lose the range of motion. So I'm going to lose volume. I'm going to lose progression that way, aren't I?
I would say that's a great question, young Jeff. The one thing I'll say is, well, if we,
because I got to maximize my gains in a 5-year window, Nick. It's got to happen like right now.
I would say if we keep training the bench press and you keep telling me that you feel like you have someone stabbing you in the shoulder, 9 out of 10 pain, you probably won't have a shoulder to do any volume in a few months or years. So if you think about it, the volume that we're doing with the floor press is probably better in the long term. But no, I would say, and that's something I get a lot. I say, well, we're going to switch from this movement to another movement. I don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to lose my gains in my chest, for example. It just goes then to explaining how we maintain these training effects much longer than we may think. Even time completely off. Not to plug another one of the things that I've made, but the quarantine comeback, where we talked about time completely off from training and how much we do maintain strength and size. So if we can take time completely off and still have that repeated bout effect, which is basically the more we do something, the better we get at doing it. Think of like the first time driving a car. We're all tense, our shoulders are tense, our hands are tense, we're sweating, our heart's racing. After you drive a car for a couple years, you could drive and not even know if you stop at every traffic light because it's just such an automatic thing. Similar to our gains that we make, we can tap into that repeated bout effect the more that we do it. It doesn't take much to keep it. So what I would say to that person is, don't fear losing your size or strength, because you're likely not going to. Because the floor press, if you think about it, is really, really similar to a bench press compared to time completely off or a cable fly, or it's still pretty darn close. So yeah, that's kind of how I would approach that.
So I mean, because that's like the biggest fear with people when they switch. Like they switch over from a movement they feel like, hey, I'm making good progress on, or hey, this is considered more optimal, and then they go from, let's say, that bench press or dumbbell press, like traditional pressing, to now a floor press, which is a shorter range of motion. So that's the biggest fear. But the thing that I always kind of look at is, what does it take to actually see atrophy? And that would be zero training at all for a prolonged period of time. So you're still training that same musculature. Yes, it's a little bit less range of motion. Arguably, it could be maybe more tension because there's maybe not as much momentum and things like that. And the way I kind of look at it is you're just, in a sense, resetting your baseline, because you're not going to atrophy. You're not going to regress because you're still training. You're just resetting. So that new exercise, even if it's less volume or range of motion rather, you're still going to try to progress it. You're still going to try to add reps. You're still going to try to add, load, maybe sets. So your volume from that baseline is going to go up again. So you're still going to see some type of gains. The question is, which movement actually facilitates the most gains? How do you even start to even quantify that? You would have to actually run this specific trial to just your case. And it would take a lot of time with not that many moving parts. So your data is nice and consistent. So to me, I'm like, why am I going to lose sleep stressing over that? The fact is, if I have to go to a different movement, because whether it's aches or pains or what have you, I'm just happy that I'm able to still train on a high level and I could keep myself moving forward. And that's exactly what happened in 2019 when I was going through a prep. I think I tore my upper pec doing heavy ass RDLs. That's another lesson learned there. But I was very lucky that I was able to do what I was doing. Is I was doing a pin press on the Smith machine. So my range of motion was maybe the top third of the movement on a press for chest. And that was it. And that's all I can do. I was just happy that I could still train and progress from there. So obviously I started with light loads and then I worked my way up and eventually it got hard and I was progressing. But sometimes you gotta have to just, humble yourself a little bit, relax a little bit and be okay. And just think of it as just resetting your baseline is all.